today on CityCast Denver. It feels like every time I hear anything about Denver International Airport, they're asking for more money. And it happened again last week. The airport announced it needs another $1 billion to finish the Great Hall project. What the heck is going on here? Fortunately, Denver Post reporter John Murray is on the show today to break down this entire 4-year-long boondoggle of a project, just in time for the airport to get crazy busy over the holidays. Today is Wednesday, December 15th, 2021. I'm Avery Lill, and this is CityCast Denver.
It sounded like you wanted to go kind of a little bit more holistic or historical on Great Hall and DIA.
The whole saga.
It's like a Tolkien saga.
John, welcome to CityCast Denver.
Thanks for having me.
How much of your brain is taken up with this DIA Great Hall saga?
You know, it's something that I was trying to remember the other day. I started covering it a year or so before they started construction. So back in early mid 2017, when they were discussing and putting together the contract, the original contract for this. And so, yeah, it's been a good 4.5 years.
That is a long time. So just to get the latest, you reported this weekend that the airport is now asking for an additional $1.1 billion to complete the Great Hall project. What is all that money for?
So the basic answer is that is to kind of go back and do most of what they had originally set out to do. 2 years ago, it ran into trouble. A year and a half ago, they scaled it back to complete it within more or less the original budget, plus some contingency. And their argument now is, hey, we're going to have to do the rest of this at some point because DIA is going to resume growing. It's already about back to where it was in 2019 in terms of passenger traffic. And they think it's going to continue on an upward trajectory. So if they don't do it now or add it back to the project now, it's only going to get more expensive and it's only going to be more of a hindrance for passengers.
So they're saying this will actually save money in the long run.
Basically, yes. Yeah, basically, yes. $1 billion now, more later. And so instead of stopping at the halfway point, which is what they ended up being able to do with the original budget, they're saying let's spend bigger now and finish it off.
I've got to say my brain somewhat short circuits when we're talking about amounts of money this large. Let's go back to Chapter 1, though. How did the Great Hall project even start?
So it started, if you remember the last big project, kind of as a signpost, that was a decade ago, and then finishing around 2014, 2015, they built out the hotel and transit center just south of the terminal. That has big plaza connecting it, the big Westin Hotel, and then where the A-Line train comes into Union Station, they built that. And so as they got off of their plate, they looked ahead and they talked about this Great Hall thing, which is, hey, this terminal was built in 1995. It was originally intended to have about 50 million people coming through every year. Now, by 2019, we had 69 million. They think they're even on an upward trajectory of 100 million in the next decade or so. Which sounds, pretty optimistic, but I've heard crazier things. So they, in around 2015 or so, started to put together this project, and then we're able to start going through bid processes and selecting contractors in 2017, and then they inked a deal, and 2018 it got underway.
And what was the original hope? It sounds like obviously to accommodate more passengers, but what else did they want to do with it?
They also wanted to update and refresh the facility too. Also adapt to just changes in air travel, right? So when it was built, DIA just had these long banks of check-in counters, right? Because everybody went up and saw a ticket agent when they got to the airport if they were checking a bag, all that stuff. We didn't have self-check-in on apps before you got there or digital boarding passes, things like that. So what they really wanted to do was modernize that part of the process and say, hey, we don't need just these walls of counters. We need larger areas, more friendly areas to have lines that are not twisting everywhere, and for people to kind of serve themselves, have space for these kiosks and stuff like that. And then on the security side of things, This was the last major airport built before 9/11 in the United States. After 9/11, obviously the security situation changed and they had to get more serious about security, and it also took longer. Also, DIA continued to grow, so just the footprint of security got bigger and has gotten more constrained over time. And it's also, if you think about the atrium of the terminal at the airport, there's always kind of been this worrisome factor of, hey, it's a little bit vulnerable from above. You have all these walkways above security, whether it's like, contraband getting through or just people being vulnerable to attack from above. They're kind of had been touchy about talking about that for a number of years, but that was really one of the main concerns about, hey, let's move security to different spaces where we can kind of expand the capacity. So they talked about doing that upstairs where some of the ticket counters are, then making more space for ticket counters by kind of reconfiguring other parts of the upstairs of the terminal.
And I read in your story that this whole project was supposed to be finished this year, but I moved to Denver about 3 years ago, and it's been under construction the entire time I've been here. You've been reporting on this for more than 4 years. The story is almost old enough to go to kindergarten. Why is it taking so long?
The first kind of big hiccup in the saga, to mix metaphors, is that so it starts in 2018, and early in 2019, we started to find out publicly, getting tips that, hey, there's some problems on this project. Initially, it was some battles between the airport and the contractors called Great Hall Partners, a big Spanish conglomerate called Ferrovial out of Madrid. They're leading this with a Centennial-based local company called Saunders Construction. And it's this big, giant public-private partnership. Early on, there's a battle over concrete, the original concrete in the terminal, because they're extending the upper level into the atrium a little bit. You need structural steel support. And the concern was that in testing, it's not strong enough to support that. Now, there's a lot of twists and turns there. In the end, they were able to accommodate that. It did delay the project or start the delays on the project, though. And it didn't end up being quite as bad as they had feared it would be. But that's just one step. There's also, at this time, battles between the contractors and the airport officials, including the CEO, Kim Day, who'd been there for, I think, over 10 years at that point. She's an architect herself, and the contractors thought that she was micromanaging the project, requiring her approval and sign off for a lot of decisions, as well as problems with other airport officials. On the other side, they have said that the contractors underestimated the cost of the project, that they were delaying the project themselves by taking forever to make decisions on their end, that their timelines were too optimistic, and just a whole battery of disputes and finger pointing back and forth started to play out. And this is in the first year of the project. And it disintegrates to the point where in August of 2019, after there's been months of reporting in the media about some of these problems and the delays that are starting to mount and costs that are starting to skyrocket in the projections, they end up terminating the contract, which is a huge step that very rarely happens in public contracting.
And to do that, they essentially had to pay the contractors to go away or to terminate their contract, right?
Yeah, they had to pay out everything they owed. They had to pay for all the materials that were on order. There were some even millions of dollars of, hey, this public-private deal that you had that was going to last 30 plus years, you had considerations down the line and expected returns on your investment. We have to compensate that. It didn't end up being a huge amount of money, but it's public money, so any amount is something I think that raises eyebrows.
So how does the pandemic fit into all of this?
Well, I mentioned that the termination happened in August of 2019. They hired a new set of contractors. They came on in February and March of 2020 and picked up the ball and got the project back on track. And if you recall, that is right as the pandemic was setting in. So just within weeks of them starting, air traffic just plummeted across the country to the lowest levels in a couple of decades. And actually, for the purposes of if you're doing a lot of work in an airport that's very disruptive, that's a great situation to get more work done. So they were able to keep the schedule moving. They didn't get delayed on the project any further. and they kept it rolling. They were able to do some of the stuff they had intended to do at night, some of that kind of disruptive, noisy work, more of it during the day because they weren't as worried about impacting passengers who, at least for several weeks or a couple months there, were not traveling in big numbers at all.
But now there's a lot of question about what the airport industries or what the airline industries are going to look like and what people are going to be flying for as we've kind of learned how to meet over Zoom and stuff. Does that change the estimates on how much people are going to be using the airport or what the value of the Great Hall Project is?
It's a good question, and there's not a great answer yet. I will say that DIA has had one of the fastest recoveries of any U.S. airport, which is a little surprising. But when you think about it, compared to the coastal airports in the United States, we have international flights, but not nearly as many. So we are most reliant on connecting traffic here. Southwest and United and even Frontier, they have a lot of connecting flights through Denver, people who never leave the airport. And that picks back up because domestic leisure travel, people going on vacations and trips, especially after they were stir crazy after the lockdown and into the second half of last year and then continuing all through this year, has really driven up the traffic. So the first half of this year, that was enough to make it the third busiest airport in the world as far as the number of people going through, which is pretty astounding. That's not going to last, but and it is probably starting to decline now. But yeah, the question going forward is what does this industry look like going into the future? It looks pretty clear like DIA is going to resume growing. Their projections for next year are that they're going to have their first record year since the pandemic, beating pre-pandemic.
In all, how much money are we in at this point? How much has the airport spent so far?
I got spreadsheets to help me keep track of this. So the either spent or committed through what they now call phase 1 and 2. They just finished phase 1 to take down the construction walls in the middle of the concourse. That makes it easier to get through. Phase 2 is underway now with moving the one security upstairs checkpoint. They're all in right now for $770 million, give or take, wherever those budgets end up. And they're, Kim Day had been committed and promised to hold it to that. However, as the new CEO came in and there's kind of this current of extra appetite from city council, some members of city council, like, hey, let's not leave security hanging. Let's finish out at least that part of it. So they're not going to a council that is just putting its hands up and saying no more. But the question is, will council go for $1.1 billion, which is more than double what they've spent already? So if they get through with that, it would bring the whole project up to like almost $1.9 billion. One thing I will note, because I think this is what I think a lot of people were reacting to with that story over the weekend, reporting on this, is that, this $1.9 billion price tag really includes most of what they originally set out to do. And so you're talking about the original project, give or take. There's a few components they're leaving on the cutting room floor for more than twice the money that they had originally budgeted. And I think that is one thing that breeds frustration and distrust of government is when entities like this, even though DIA pays its own freight, it generates its own revenue. This is not coming out of city tax dollars. The fact that they're doing basically the original project and they admit now that working with those contractors originally, they just got the price wrong, that they way lowballed it. Materials costs have gone up since then, labor costs, all that. So that adds some extra unforeseen costs, but they really just whiffed it at the start and just did not understand how much it was going to cost.
I'm really glad you also brought up where the money is coming from. It's not taxpayers' dollars, but it is public money. How does that work?
So you think of how an airport operates, and I guess not everybody knows the intricacies, but it's off of its own revenue. So you think, like, just as a passenger, you pay for parking. That's a lot of money at the airport. All of the concessions, restaurants and shops at the airport pay rent and a share of their revenue to the airport for being there. The airlines pay rents and landing fees and all of those various operating costs. And so all that adds up. And so really the key stakeholders that the airport has to keep on board with projects like this are the airlines, because in the end, they're going to end up paying for a lot of the projects. They'll pass it on to passengers, of course. But so far, the airlines do seem on board with this. They want a growing airport. They're eager to grow here. And I think that is sort of one of those hard truths that people look at this and say, hey, like, gosh, $1.1 billion, think of what the city could do with that. The problem is that we don't have a $1.1 billion if it's not being spent at the airport on this project, because otherwise you'd have to get the airlines to kick in money for city projects outside the airport. That's not going to happen, obviously. So
it's not like it could become sidewalk money or something like that, even
right.
if it didn't become DIA Great Hall money.
Right. And that's hard to digest, I think, for some folks, because, it's sort of to improve on its own grounds, DIA has a blank check as long as they can keep their stakeholders on board, because those stakeholders will pay for it in the form of increased fees. But those are not fees that would go to things outside of the airport.
Well, John, I just want to thank you so much for helping us unspool this long and complicated story. And thanks for being on CityCast Denver.
Oh, thanks. My pleasure.
And so the saga of the Great Hall project continues. John told me if City Council approves the additional $1.1 billion, work could continue through 2028. That's 10 years after the whole thing started. So yes, travelers will still have to deal with construction around the holidays this year and next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. And here's what else is happening in Denver today. Denver's top public safety official is leaving his position in January. The Denver Post reports that Murphy Robinson, who's been the executive director of the Denver Department of Public Safety since January 2020, said he's been planning to leave for some time. He's been criticized for how the Denver police responded to protests in 2020, as well as for removing the public safety representatives from a community-led task force working to reform public safety following the protests. The city hasn't announced a nominee to replace him yet. And fruity vape cartridges aren't going anywhere. Stores in Denver can continue to sell flavored tobacco products. According to Denverite, Mayor Michael Hancock vetoed a bill last week that would have banned selling them. City Council needed at least 9 votes to overturn the veto, and Monday night, only 8 council members voted to overturn. One last thing, be careful out there today because it's going to be windy, like hurricane-force winds in Denver. And that means driving top-heavy cars is going to be riskier, and there might be some power outages. That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed the show, why not take a minute to tell a friend about us? Rate the show wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to our morning newsletter at denver.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye, y'all. I feel weird about congratulating vapors. I don't want kids to vape. I mean, I don't think that that's the most important thing, but I don't want to celebrate it.